What is going on, my friends? I'm coming to you today with a different type of video on the heels of playing in a paper event this past weekend. I don't get to play in paper events too often, so when I do, I always try to make the most of them. And I was fortunate enough to come away with a win in the Gathering Places main event this weekend. It was 235-ish players, and I wound up victorious, winning the whole thing, the main event. So today what I want to do is talk through my tournament, starting with my deck list, some of the choices that I made, and then go through round by round and kind of give a little bit of context in terms of how I got to that finish line at the very end of the tournament. So my matches were on camera. I'll reference them and I'll put in some clips with some specific moments that I wanted to talk about. Let's start from the top. Let me take you through my deck list from this past weekend. I want to talk through just a couple of things in terms of why I made the decisions that I did with regards to the list that I brought to the tournament. As most people probably would have guessed, I brought Black-Green Yawgmoth to the event, but it actually wasn't my first choice for this event. I was actually strongly considering bringing Lonus Samwise combo, but the deck just felt a little too inconsistent and a little too gimmicky. So I wound up going back to my tried and true, and I kind of did a cram session the week before the event, testing just to refamiliarize myself with the format from Yawgmoth's perspective, and just try to refine my list a little bit more for the metagame that I expected. And the two decks that I was really harping in on with regards to my testing were Tron and Scam. And as you'll see as I get into the tournament, it was good that I was prepared for those decks because they were a very prominent part of my tournament experience. So looking at my deck list, the first thing you'll notice, particularly with the mana base, is that I didn't have Dried Arbor in my list this past weekend. It's the first time I've played an event where I have not had Dried Arbor in my 75. And the reason I chose not to run it, I really wanted my mana to be consistent over the course of the tournament. And I didn't want to have to mulligan hands because there was a Dried Arbor in it. And I also didn't want to be susceptible to getting my Dried Arbors Bowmastered. So I opted not to have it in the 75. And as you'll see, it really paid off because I did not mulligan a lot. And I had really good mana throughout the entire weekend, which I think was a big part of why I had the success that I did. Another thing you'll notice with the mana base is that I have Pendelhaven in the list. And Pendelhaven is a very subtle addition. It doesn't make a big splash when it's in play, but it's actually really valuable and was really important in a couple of my matches. Just getting an extra point of damage a couple turns in a row with attackers was the difference in my, I think, round 6 feature match between getting enough damage across to win or what would have been a loss otherwise. So it was really critical. And it's nice to have because it protects your 1 toughness creatures from opposing Bowmasters in Ren 6. So a really nice addition to the list, and I really liked its inclusion this past weekend. My creature suite, starting with the 1-drops, I had 4 Delighted Halflings, which is pretty stock at this point. And then I opted for 3 Ignoble Hierarchs, which is a little bit of a point of contention because of once again, the presence of Bowmasters in the format. Hierarchs are important because they really do help you smooth out your curve over the course of the first couple of turns. And if you're not playing against a Bowmaster deck, they're the best creature you could have pretty much as a 1-drop. So I was happy that I included 3. There was a little bit of a deliberation whether or not to run 2 and a Gilded Goose or run the 3, but I opted for the 3 because I really wanted my mana to be consistent. That was like the thing I wanted the most out of my list, now that there's a heavier emphasis on black within these decks. The next thing that I really had to deliberate when I was building out this deck list was I wanted to play 4 Orcish Bowmasters in the main deck. The card is just busted. It's really good. Everybody knows about it, obviously. And it synergizes really well with Yawgmoth. It helps give you an extra creature to sacrifice, and it helps with your Court of Calling. So it was something that I wanted to do when building out this list. But in order for me to do that, I had to make a concession somewhere else. And what that meant was that I'd have to move Hapatra to the sideboard if I wanted to run the full suite of 4 Bowmasters. That was the only way I could figure out how to fit it. And what I decided, kind of at the 11th hour, I think it was last Thursday, that I actually came to the conclusion, but I decided that the first Hapatra in the main deck was probably better than the 4th Bowmaster. And the utility of having an extra sideboard slot for another matchup was much more valuable than that 4th Bowmaster in the main deck as well. So I initially had Hapatra in the sideboard. I shifted her over to the main deck, and I cut the 4th Bowmaster for the list just because I couldn't figure out the room to make the full playset work. The last thing is that with regard to the main deck is a lot of people know me for being a prosperous Innkeeper enthusiast, and that hasn't changed. I still am, but right now Yawgmoth lists are running Shieldred, and the reason being is because it's really good against the One Ring, and it's really good against Rhinos, and it's really good against Scam. And in order to have Shieldred in the list, same sort of thing with Hapatra and Bowmasters, you need to make a concession somewhere. And Innkeeper's a little bit worse now because of Bowmasters in the format. So it's just the reasonable swap with regards to including Shieldred into the main deck. Cut the Innkeeper. They essentially do fill a similar role when you're trying to combo, and Shieldred comes in. Moving on to the sideboard, there were a couple of different things that were pulling me in different directions with regards to how to build out this sideboard. And the first thing was whether or not I include the One Ring, which has been a very popular inclusion in a lot of Yawgmoth sideboards since the printing of Lord of the Rings. Initially, that was what I was planning on doing. I had One Rings in my sideboard up until probably Tuesday of last week. And because I wanted to get an accurate representation of whether or not it was the best card, I also wanted to test kind of its counterpart, its green counterpart, which is Elven Chorus. What I was finding when I was testing the One Ring is that people are prepared for it. There's just so much hate within the format between Bowmaster and Shieldred that it really wasn't as powerful more recently as it was when it was initially printed. And what I liked about Elven Chorus is that it snowballs really quickly, the same way the One Ring does. With Yawgmoth, fetch lands, and tutors, you have a lot of utility and a lot of agency with regards to what's on top of your deck, so I could kind of play around whether or not there was a creature or there wasn't a creature on top of my deck. And the beautiful thing, Elven Chorus doesn't get hit by Bowmaster, and it doesn't get hit by Shieldred. So with those two cards being so prominent, with the Chorus in play, they're irrelevant. It doesn't matter that they're there. You're still essentially drawing cards and generating card advantage. So what wound up happening is I played Chorus like once or twice last week in leagues, and it was just so good in the matchups that I wanted it, that it was a no-brainer for me to include Chorus over the One Ring in my sideboard. And if you watch the quarterfinals match that I had against Scam, which we'll go over later in the video, you'll see why that was such a good inclusion. So I was happy with that choice. The other two big things with regards to my sideboard, and what you'll notice about the way it's constructed, is I have the inclusion of a Collector Oof. I don't love Collector Oof, but it's really, really good against Tron right now. Shuts off maps, stars, spheres, rings, relics. It does so much in that matchup that it's a really, really solid inclusion to have against them, and they don't have that many answers to it, so it can really, really slow down their game plan. So that was the one reason I wanted to have an oof in the sideboard. The second thing was I had two Haywire Mites, which is not usual. It's not conventional when building Yawgmoth lists. It was something that I started testing in the middle of last week, and once again, it was just something that really surprised me in terms of how effective it was for the current metagame. Once again, it's okay against Tron. I don't love it in that matchup, but it has text as long as there's not a Karn the Great Creator in play. And then it's really, really good against decks with Leyline Binding and the One Ring. So your 4-color Control or 4-color Omnath matchup, bringing in both of those is really, really useful. Whereas something like Force of Vigor oftentimes will only hit one target, and it doesn't hit the One Ring. So I wound up shaving from my normal 3 Force of Vigor and included a second Haywire Mite in that slot. And I have to say, the entire weekend, Haywire Mite was consistently the best performing card out of my sideboard. It just, over and over again, it was just really, really good. So I'm glad that I had the 2 copies. The other parts of my sideboard that were a little bit different is this is the first big event that I've run where I was not running Thoughtseize. In order to make room for Chalices and Necromentia, those are going to occupy the same slots that a Thoughtseize would when you're mapping out your matchups for your sideboard. So with the inclusion of both Chalices and Necromentia, Thoughtseizes got cut. Necromentia, really, the reason it's there, 90% of the reason it's there, once again for Tron, wanting to hit Tron lands on turn 2 or turn 3 before they have the chance to establish the full 3 Tron lands. And it's also fine against Cascade decks. It's not excellent, but it's okay. And then Chalices are for Cascade decks as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about those at the end of the video and what my actual intentions were versus what happened over the course of the event. So now that you have a little bit of an idea in terms of my thought process with the construction of the deck, let's jump into the Swiss rounds. I'll walk you through round by round how it went and talk you through some of the fun and interesting key points of my event this past weekend. All right, so I started things off round 1 against a very nice gentleman by the name of Joey. Joey was playing Burn, and I should have been tipped off to the fact that he was playing Burn before we even started playing our match, because he had the red deck box that has the red mana symbol on it, and his sleeves were also red, which I found over the course of the years that 90% of the time when somebody's doing that, they're usually playing Burn. I didn't notice that when I first sat down across from him, but I probably should have observed that and been cognizant that that was what I was playing against. But this match, Joey was a super nice guy from the Wilmington area. He was friends with a couple of people that I met over the course of the weekend. It wasn't particularly eventful. Games 1 and 2, I was able to establish a Blood Artist and a Shieldred in play. And then once Shieldred got going, it was just game over. I stabilized at 1 life in game 2, but it quickly got out of control and wound up back at like 7 or 9 life before he scooped. So it was a quick 2-0 victory and 1-0 in the tournament. Round 2, I played against another Wilmington player by the name of Rob, also a super nice guy. I'm probably going to say that a lot over the course of this video because all my opponents were really, really cordial and just good people. But Rob was playing Glimpse combo, which was a matchup that I think I was favored in just because of the way my sideboard was constructed. And in our first game of the match, Rob mulliganed pretty aggressively down to a 4-card hand and just never got off the ground. So I kind of got like a free game win because of that. When he and I were chatting after the first game and I figured out what he was playing, I had mentioned to him that a majority of the time when I played against his deck, the way that I won was just his deck faltering when it was flipping off of its glimpse. It's just such a high variance deck. It just beats itself because the glimpse flips are just, you never know what you're going to get. And that was a little bit of foreshadowing for game 3. And I want to walk you through a situation in terms of how the game played out, and then you can see how it ended. So I had a Chalice in play, and he had a Glimpse suspended with 2 counters on it. And I drew into a Necromentia, and I decided to cast Necromentia targeting Force of Vigor to limit his outs to my Chalice in play. So after doing that, he had a Boseiju in play already. I knew that he only had 2 outs within his deck. He had an Otawara, and he had another Boseiju, and he had to draw them within the next turn. He basically had 1 turn to draw them in order to be able to get my Chalice and get his Glimpse to resolve that was on suspend. It turns out Joey drew into the Otawara like a savage, Otawara back my Chalice, and then his Glimpse came off suspend during his next upkeep. He glimpsed, and he was at 1 life. I had a Blood Artist in play. He had 6 flips, and he hit 2 more glimpses, so those are whiffs. And then he hit Colony Garden, Shardless Agent, and a fetch land. And my board was full of creatures. So at that point, he was just dead, and he could have. There was nothing he could really do about it because his deck kind of just, piddled out and beat itself. And one of the things I was curious about, I was going to call a judge over if the situation arose, which I think I still would have won in this situation, was that if he glimpsed and he hit 2 of the same legendary creatures, Emrakul or Atraxa, he would have had to make the choice to keep 1 in play and 1 would go to the graveyard. And I believe that would have triggered my Blood Artist. I'm not 100% sure. That also could have been a way that I would have won had his glimpse flipped some legitimate threats, which it didn't. So I won 2-1, and I was up 2-0 in the tournament. Round 3, I played against a gentleman by the name of Anderson, and Anderson was playing Green Tron. This was my first time playing against Tron in the tournament, but not my last. I'd come prepared for this matchup with my sideboard, and it was something that I was expecting to face, so I wasn't surprised when my opponent led off on a Tron land turn 1. Our match was drawn out. It was a long match. But it was only 2 games, and that was because our first game was a 40-minute game that was crazy. Let me set the scene for you here. Anderson establishes Tron, casts in Ulamog, triggers, gets rid of 2 of my threats off the board. I didn't have, I think it was a Hapatra and a Yawgmoth, so those were out of the question, out of play. I had another Yawgmoth in hand, so I wind up casting that on my next turn. And I had a board full of insects from my grist. So what I wound up doing is I wound up knocking down the Ulamog with my Yawgmoth, sacrificing the insect tokens. And then I wound up proliferating it another 2 times down to a 3/3. He attacks in, the proliferate happened during the attack phase, so he didn't know that it was going to happen. I don't think he was aware of it. And my cards are in Japanese, so I don't know if that's inconsiderate of me or not, but a lot of people don't know what Yawgmoth does, all of the text on it. Attacks in, exiles the top 20 cards in my library. If he does another attack on the next turn, I'm just going to lose because I don't have enough cards left in my library. So his attack with a 5/5, I proliferate it down to a 3/3. I chump block it with a Yawgmoth, and then the next turn I'm able to sacrifice 1 more creature, put it down to a 2/2, proliferate it 2 more times, and kill the Ulamog. And then what wound up happening was about 2 turns later, I ultimated my Grist and killed him with the ultimate and attacks from a board full of creatures. But that game was crazy. I almost scooped when he cast the Ulamog because the game had already taken a really long time and I was looking at the clock. But I am grateful that I didn't because I was able to pull it out. And I think that's the first and only time I've ever done that against a resolved Ulamog without the potential to combo in my deck, because Blood Artist was already exiled as well. So we're 3-0, and round 4, I wind up playing against what is usually a really good matchup for Yawgmoth. I was playing against White-Black Hammer Time, a gentleman by the name of Cody. And Cody actually wound up top 8ing the event as the 8th seed, so he helped I think he helped my breakers. I don't know how that works, but I think he did. Cody, unfortunately, fell victim to the Thoughtseize bug in the second game of our match. He had the Black Splash for Thoughtseize. He Thoughtseizes me on turn 1, sees my hand. It was chock full of good stuff. I had a Yawgmoth, I think I had a Chord of Calling, a Wall of Roots, a Haywire Might, and he opted to take the Haywire Might. And the reason he did that was because his hand had a Stoneforge Mystic, and his game plan was to Stoneforge, get a Cauldron complete, and kill me with that before I had the chance to establish my game plan. Fortunately, I was playing 2 Haywire Mites in my list, and like a savage, I peel the second bite off the top on my next turn. So I wound up just casting that out. He looked defeated in the face when he saw it. And then the rest of the game was really uneventful. He never was able to do anything, and I just built out my game plan with a Grist, a Yawgmoth, and then I just wound up killing him pretty easily. So we're 4-0 right now, which brings us to match 5, where I played against Green Tron for the second time in the event. I played against Randy, who wound up being my top 4, my semifinals opponent. I honestly don't remember too much about this match, except I resolved a Necromentia in game 2 for one of his Tron pieces, which is the only time I resolved it against Tron in the entire tournament, but it felt good when I did it, and I did win that game. I wound up beating Randy in 3 games, and I was his only loss in the Swiss rounds. He wound up cruising the way the rest of the way through the tournament, and wound up as like the 3 seed in the top 8. Round 6, this match was also against Green Tron. This was a backup feature match, so you can watch game 3 on camera. I'll link it in the description with a timestamp, so you can watch that match if you want to. I was playing against Marvin. Marvin was a really good player, really nice guy. I enjoyed playing against him. And in the match, in game 3, is where we're going to go because it's on camera and I can walk you through this a little bit. I was on a mulligan to 5, and I was beating down with an Orcish Bowmaster, a Yawgmoth, and an Orc Army token with Pendelhaven, so I was pumping it, hitting for 4 every turn. Marvin was down to, I believe, 7 life, and I was in a situation where I had just run into Eldritch Evolution, so I can Evo away my Bowmaster and get myself a Yawgmoth. And when I did that, you'll see in the video that Marvin activates his ring in response. So he's essentially at 6 life because we know he's going to take a point of damage off the ring during his upkeep. In this situation, what I wound up doing is I wound up doing a couple of different things for the turn, and then I passed the turn back. So it actually gave him an opportunity to basically win the game if he had Tron from there. What I could have done in this instance, and this is my fault because all my cards are in Japanese, like I had mentioned, and my brain thought that Grist, the Hunger Tide, said target opponent loses life equal to the number of creatures in your graveyard for its ultimate, but the reality is it says each opponent. So I can do that through the One Ring's protection, which he had, but I was not cognizant of that. I was thinking the wording was different, so I was getting punished for having my cards in Japanese. What I could have done is I could have sacrificed all of my creatures into the graveyard, proliferated up my Grist, discarding the other Yawgmoth that was in my hand, also proliferating up his One Ring to 2, ultimate Grist goes to the graveyard. That would have been my 5th creature in the graveyard. Would have put him down to 2, and then I could have had the ring deal him 2 damage during his upkeep, which would have been game over. Wouldn't have given him the opportunity to establish Tron and do something on his turn. I didn't do that. Fortunately, he was not able to do anything meaningful on his turn, and I ultimated Grist on the following turn and wound up winning the game. So I got lucky on that one. I didn't see the line, and I didn't know what my card did, but in the future and later in the tournament, I knew what my card did, and I did not make that mistake again. So round 7, I'm 6-0. I'm feeling really good. This is going to be the last match of the day. And I sit down against my opponent. We're at table 3, I think. Table 2. And I'm thinking I'm facing off against another undefeated player because I'm undefeated, and why wouldn't I? But it turns out there are only 3 of us that are still undefeated in the tournament, and I wind up getting the pair down. And to my dismay, my opponent, Evan, is playing my worst matchup, Rhinos, and has won the die roll and proceeds to just completely stomp me out over the course of the 2 games we play. So I got paired down and I got destroyed, and I didn't finish the first day undefeated. So I was feeling pretty demoralized and pretty down, knowing that I was going to have to likely win my next 2 rounds to make the top 8. So I left day 1 feeling a little down in the dumps, despite the fact that I had a really good performance. Felt more pressure on me than I would have felt in that instance because I felt like I was playing really, really well, and I did a good job up to that point to achieve the record that I did. But there was nothing I could do. I wound up losing very quickly and wound up with a 6-1 record, 5th place going into day 2. Round 8, the next day, I wound up back on camera as a backup feature match. So our first game of the match was not shown. The second match was. And once again, I get paired into the only other X1 Rhinos player in the event. And similarly to what happened the day before against Evan, my opponent Mark stomped me out very, very quickly, being on the play once more. There really wasn't too much I could do to catch up after he had the starts that the deck is very consistent at producing. The last turn of the game, it was on camera. I had a choice to make. I had a Yawgmoth in hand, I had a Patra and a Yawgmoth in play, and my opponent attacked with a 2/2 Rhino that I had proliferated down. And I could have double blocked and gone down to, I would have stayed at 2 life, and it would have protected me if my opponent had a removal spell for one of my creatures because the Rhino has trample. But what I wound up doing is I wound up chump blocking with just the Patra. He had the Flame of Anor. He flamed down my Hepatra, and I wound up dying to the trample damage. I probably should have double blocked, but with the Yawgmoth in my hand, I wanted to have access to at least 1 draw with the Yawgmoth, being able to target something and draw an extra card. But I guess I was greedy in that instance, and I probably should have double blocked just to play it safe. His list was really cool, I will say. Mutavault in the list, which I hadn't seen before, which was really nice in game 1. It wound up getting in some extra chip damage, and it plays nicely with Flame of Anor because you can activate it. It's every creature type, and then you get to use 2 modes on the card instead of 1 mode. So it's a little cute, it's a little techy, but it was actually really good in our matchup, and it seemed to serve him well over the course of the week. So at this point, I have taken 2 straight losses to my worst matchup. I feel like my dreams are crushed, my emotions are at an all-time low during this tournament. I thought I was eliminated for top 8 at this point. Maybe an outside shot at making it in, but my thought was there was probably going to be 2 X2s that made the top 8. And because I had suffered 2 straight losses, and I thought it was too early in the tournament to have my second loss, I just assumed that I was probably going to be 9th or 10th place if I won out from that point. But I said, you know what, I'm just going to forget those losses, and I'm just going to keep playing, do my best, try to finish with my best record possible. So round 9, I get paired against Ricky, who I had met the day before, who was a super nice guy. He introduced himself, came up to me out of nowhere, introduced himself, told me where he was from, which is an area I was considering moving to. I am considering moving to. So he's just like, he was like the nicest guy. So he was really, really cool. And it was really awesome of him to put himself out there though. But unfortunate that we got paired against each other, especially so late in the tournament, because it meant one of us was going to be moving on. One of us was going to be out of contention. Ricky was playing a fairly unusual build of a 5-color Goryo's Vengeance, Atraxa, Gristlebrand, Ephemerate, Solitude, Grief, Blink deck. In theory, I feel like this should probably be a bad matchup for my deck, just because if he is able to establish a turn 1 Grief with an Ephemerate, or a turn 1 or turn 2 or turn 3 Solitude with Ephemerate, and just wipe my board, it's really hard for me to come back from that. And he also has another angle of attack, being able to bring back an Atraxa from his graveyard, and that just pretty much wins the game on the spot as well. So game 1, his game plan worked as he had it built out. He was able to get an Atraxa into play, Ephemerate the Atraxa, drew essentially 8 or 9 cards, 2 of which were Griefs, griefed me twice, stripped everything from my hand, and then I lost from there. There was nothing I can do. Games 2 and 3, I didn't have too much to sideboard in against him. I think I brought in a Pylon, an Endurance, and I brought in 1 or 2 Haywire Mites because he had Leyline Binding and Fable the Mirror Breaker in his deck. So I think I brought in 3 cards. I think I only brought in 1 Mite. And I was a little on edge because I felt like if he was going to go for his combo line, so to speak, of reanimating one of his big fatties, my chances of being able to interact with it were going to be much less than what it normally would be with a full play set of Endurance, where I felt more comfortable. But I only had 3 Endurance in my 75, so I was working with what I had. Fortunately, his deck sputtered a little bit. He didn't get out of the gates very quickly. He didn't really have all of the pieces to the puzzle to be able to do the thing. And in games 2 and 3, I was able to grind out the victory just using Yawgmoth for value, and eventually I found an Endurance to hit his graveyard so he couldn't bring back an Atraxa. And then I was able to hit his Leyline Bindings with my Might. So it all worked out. I wound up winning very, very close, grindy 3-game set against Ricky to move on to 7-2 record, with the potential for a win in the next round for the top 8. And round 10, the last match of the Swiss, I wind up playing against Sean, who was also a really cool guy. He was on 4-color Omnath, and I knew he was on 4-color Omnath because during one of my feature matches, he was sitting next to me, so I was able to kind of see what he was playing, and I knew what his list looked like. And the thing about these lists, or these new builds of 4-color Omnath, I honestly don't think they're very good. Sorry if you play the deck, I'm being honest here. At least I don't think it's very good against what I'm doing. The deck feels very slow and dirtily, and its mana base is very painful, and it doesn't have Fury in it. So for me, being a creature-based strategy, I'm really not as scared of them casting Solitude as I am them casting Fury. So it doesn't really interact with what I'm doing as well as the older versions of the Elementals decks. And then them drawing a bunch of cards, they're just drawing more cards that draw cards. So it was just like, okay, you can draw cards. Sure, be my guest. But anyway, I won this match, and I won games 1 and 3 very convincingly. Game 3, I was faced with a similar situation as I was in my on-camera feature match round 6, where my opponent had a ring in play. I had a Grist and a Yawgmoth, and I was able to proliferate the Grist to have enough loyalty on it to be able to ultimate it, and proliferate up the ring so it would kill him during his upkeep if it came to that. So he was at 4 life, proliferated up the Grist, ultimated the Grist, and my expectation that he was going to Endurance my graveyard, or at least I was cognizant that that was a possibility. He was tapped out, but I thought that was a possibility. So I wanted to have a backup plan in case that didn't work. So ultimate the Grist. He didn't wind up having the Endurance. Grist killed him, but had it gone back to his turn, he would have just died to the ring anyway. So I learned from my mistakes. I won't make that mistake again, and I wound up winning fairly convincingly in 3 games to finish the Swiss rounds with an 8-2 record. And, drumroll, I got very, very lucky. My breakers were good after starting 6-0, and I wound up being the 7 seed going into the top 8. So for my top 8 matches, all of my matches were on camera, so I will link those and timestamp those in the description below. If you want to watch them in their entirety, you can certainly do that after I finish talking to you here. But what I want to do is I just want to talk through a couple of key points that were on camera to share kind of my thought process and what was going on kind of like below the surface that maybe the commentators didn't catch on to or weren't able to see without having full access to our hand. So my quarterfinal match was against Jake, who was playing Black Red Scam, and some of you might know Jake because he is the reigning Pro Tour champion. And it was funny when I got paired against him. I had a flashback to the day before because a friend of mine had said to me through a text message, my friend is out in California, he said, "Oh, I heard the Pro Tour champion is there." And I said, I'll pull up the text message on the screen here, but I said something like, "Oh, I'm not scared, he can get it too." This was when I was like 3-0 in the event, but basically I was just messing around. But it was funny because I wound up playing against him, and you know, the last time I had played in a big event and done really well, and I wound up being on camera, I was actually a little bit nervous when I was on camera, but during this event, for whatever reason, I was very calm throughout the entire event, and I felt very comfortable on camera. I wasn't nervous at all. I wasn't thinking about the fact that I was on camera, and I think I played really well because I wasn't feeling those nerves, and I wasn't being self-conscious while I was on camera. I felt comfortable. The top 8 matches were open deckless. So game one, I wound up winning. I think I established a Yawgmoth and a Shieldred on board, and he wound up just scooping up just because, or maybe it was just a Shieldred, but he wound up scooping. There was really nothing he could do to come back at that point, short of a miracle. So he saw that, he scooped it up. Game 2, he won in fairly convincing fashion, but I will say, having access to his deck list, boarded it a little bit differently than I normally would in this matchup. So I noticed that Jake had a Pithing Needle in his sideboard. I assumed he was going to be bringing in against me. So normally I would not bring in Haywire Might in this matchup, but because he had the Pithing Needle, I did bring in 1 copy of Might, which in Game 3 wound up being very, very important. It was in my opening hand, and he wound up having the Pithing Needle, to which I was able to follow that up by playing the Might on the next turn, blocking a 4/4 Fury, and then sacrificing the Fury, getting rid of the Pithing Needle, which was on Grist. And then the next turn, I stuck Elven Chorus, and things got a little out of control after that. And if you watch the game, you'll see just how powerful that card is in that matchup. And that is the primary reason why I was running this card this weekend, because of just how busted it is against Scam. They have no way to remove it. Their Bowmasters, their Shieldreds do nothing against it, and it just gets really out of control really quickly, and it fixes your mana as well. So if they have a Blood Moon, you can use the Chorus to tap your creatures for mana and continue to play cards off the top of your deck. So a lot of people think Scam is a bad matchup for Yawg. I don't think it's a good matchup, but I still think Yawg is at least 50-50 or favored in the matchup, especially with Chorus having access to that now. So I did wind up getting there in 3 games. I think I played pretty well over the course of the 3 games. I know some of my friends in the Discord pointed out I did miss a trigger or 2 with the Bowmaster. Fortunately, it didn't matter. There was a lot going on in the board state, but I think I played pretty well, and I wound up getting there in 3 games. So we're on to the semifinals, and for the 4th time this event, I see Tron once again, and it is my round 5 opponent, I believe, Randy. And Randy, I think, mulliganed down to 5 both of our games. He was on the play, but you know, that's kind of the way Tron operates. Oftentimes, the 7-card hands or the 6-card hands aren't what they need to construct Tron on turn 3 or 4, so they'll mulligan to 5 or 4 to be able to establish Tron in the early game. Randy was a very good player. He, I think, had very tight play the entire weekend from what I saw when I was watching his matches and when I was playing against him. But his draws in the 2 games we played against each other, he didn't have an Oblivion Stone either game, and he didn't have an Ugin, of which he was only running 1 copy, and that's really the haymaker that just shuts the lights out versus Yawgmoth from that deck. So because he didn't have either of those cards, I was very lucky and fortunate that I was able to just establish a huge board state. I had Hapatra in play, which drew me a gajillion cards, and eventually I was able to Eldritch Evolution, get a Blood Artist into play, a little tentatively because it gave it an opportunity to kill the Blood Artist. He didn't have the answer during his upkeep. After the Bring trigger subsided, the Protection trigger in particular, I was able to combo off during his upkeep and kill him. So moving on to the finals. Current record, I believe, is 10-2, And I wound up playing against Andrew, and he and I had been chatting over the course of the event. We were sitting next to each other pretty often, and he was really cool. He was on Blue-Red Murktide. He wound up being the only undefeated player through the Swiss rounds. He went 9-0-1, and then on to the finals. He didn't lose the entire event. We wound up going through a 3-game series. Each game was fairly lopsided. I wound up taking the first game. He wound up taking the second game. And then in game 3, there was kind of a point in the game where we were at a stalemate, and I had a wall of roots in play. I had 4 lands. He had 5 or 6 lands in play. I don't think he had a board presence. He might have had a subtlety in play, but he had 2 or 3 cards in his hand, and I knew fairly confidently that at least one of those cards was counterspell. And for that reason, I actually had 3 Yawgmoths in my hand. Not 1, not 2, but 3. And I was holding them, waiting for an opportunity where I could cast 2 spells a turn, get those both countered, and then follow up on the next turn with another Yawgmoth and another creature. So I was waiting for that moment because I didn't want to fill up his graveyard if he did have a Murktide, because his graveyard was pretty light, and I didn't want to give him Delirium or anything like that to facilitate any other of the nonsense that deck does. I didn't draw into a land to be able to double spell, so I figured, okay, at this point, I'm going to start jamming Yawgmoths because I know he's running out of gas here. So I cast my first Yawgmoth with 2 more in hand. And you'll see in the video, I just put it straight into my graveyard because I knew he had the counterspell. He didn't even say it yet, but I just put it straight into my graveyard, and then you see the counterspell show up on camera because it was pretty obvious that was what he had. At that point, I felt like he was out of gas. Unless he had top decked something, I thought he didn't have anything else. The following turn, I cast another Yawgmoth, and the commentators, they say, oh, he top decked another Yawgmoth. No, I didn't. It was in my hand the whole time. I had another one as well that I could have used. They couldn't see my hand, no fault to them, and they did a great job all weekend. But yes, the Yawg was in my hand. I was saving it for the right moment. Cast it out. It stuck. The next turn, I think I had Geist, and then I had a Shieldred the following turn, and that wound up being lights out. And I was casting those cards confidently. I knew he didn't have anything in hand. And when the Shieldred hit the board, the writing was on the wall. That's infinite life at that point with double Geist, and he scooped it up, and I wound up winning the tournament. So I was very, very fortunate to walk away victorious this past weekend. All of my opponents were super, super cool. I was really grateful. I got to meet a lot of really nice people, especially those people from the Wilmington area. My friend Dave lent me some cards for the event, so thank you to Dave for doing so. I wanted to just close out with a couple of things. Shout out to The Gathering Place. They're a store in either Raleigh or Durham, North Carolina. They're the ones that hosted the event. It was a charity event for a really good cause, the Extra Life Foundation. I'll put a link in the description below if anybody wants to donate to that cause as well. But it was a really well-run event for a good cause, and I would definitely attend future events that they run if they were to do so in this area. I am now qualified for the regional championship in Atlanta at the end of the year. I've never played Pioneer before, not a single match, not a single game, so I'm gonna have to learn that format before December. I've never actually tried to qualify for a Pro Tour before. It's never been a goal of mine, but I guess I'm gonna try this time. So we'll see if I can qualify for the Pro Tour at the end of the year. Some fun facts from the event. During the entire event, I was on the play once in game 1. In 11 rounds, I won 1 die roll. Or more than 11 rounds. 13 rounds? 13 rounds. I won 1 die roll. I was on the draw the entire top 8, and during the Swiss rounds, I won once. So I was on the play 1 time. During the Swiss rounds, up until the top 8, I did not actually combo kill once. 0 times I combo killed my opponents. The only times I combo killed were in the matches in the top 8, so you saw those. Otherwise, I didn't have a single combo kill. I just beat down people with stupid green creatures and got the job done. Would I change anything with regards to how I built my list this past weekend? I wouldn't. The deck ran perfectly. The mana was consistent all weekend. I didn't have a lot of mulligans. I was hitting my land drops. It worked out really, really well. But if I were to change something, it would be something out of my sideboard, and that would have been swapping out the second Chalice of the Void for a Soulless Jailer. The 1-1 split between those 2 cards was actually what I intended to bring into the event, but I couldn't find a Soulless Jailer in time, so I opted for the 2 Chalice of the Void instead. Lastly, did I miss Dryad Arbor? Not really. There was a couple of moments where I was like, okay, I wish I could kind of chord for Dryad Arbor here, or fetch for one, but I think the upside of not having it in my opening hands and my mana being so good all weekend, not needing to mulligan, was worth not having it in my deck. And my opponents were still playing around it. There was an instance where my opponent didn't attack with a 1-drop because they thought I could fetch for the Dryad Arbor. You know, there was a couple of mentions over the course of the Swiss rounds of me searching for a Dryad Arbor or having access to it. So I didn't have it in the deck, and I didn't really miss it. And the threat of the little green tree 1/1 was enough. The thought of the threat of it was enough to deter people from taking certain lines. So it was almost as if it was there in spirit. A really successful weekend. I walk away the champion, a little bit of money in my pocket, and I am very, very fortunate to have had the experience and been able to play in this event and have such great success. So thank you for tuning in, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed this dissertation on my event this past weekend. If you have any Yawgmoth questions, fire away. Head over to my Patreon if you want to. I'm going to be starting to upload exclusive content for my patrons, which will be Yawgmoth content, because I know a lot of people have been asking me for more of that sort of content. But I don't want to spam this channel with strictly Yawgmoth content, because I know that's not why a lot of people are here, but I do want to produce that content for people who want to see it. I'll also be starting a membership on this page with the same content that my patrons will have access to over in the Patreon. So if you want to join the membership, I would greatly appreciate the support, and I will be putting out more content there in the very near future. So thank you for tuning in today. I hope this has been fun and entertaining, and I will see you all again very soon. You know the deal, everybody. Be well.